Today on Primates Uncensored, you will hear about a female chimpanzee who achieved what no male ever could, ending a war that had consumed communities for over a decade, and creating peace through methods that defied everything we know about chimpanzee nature. This is the story of Zara, the peacemaker who proved that intelligence and compassion could triumph over violence and hatred. In the Gombe Stream National Park of Tanzania, where Jane Goodall first revolutionized our understanding of chimpanzees. Two communities had been locked in brutal warfare for 11 years. The Kasakela community to the north and the Kahama community to the south had once been a single unified group, but a violent split in the early years had created bitter enemies separated by an invisible border that ran through the heart of their former shared territory. The war between them was unlike typical chimpanzee territorial disputes. This wasn't just about resources or boundaries. This was personal, fueled by betrayal and resentment that passed from generation to generation. Young chimpanzees grew up learning to hate members of the other community, trained from infancy to see them not as fellow primates but as mortal enemies who deserved only death. The conflict had started before Zara was born, triggered when a coalition of males from what would become the Kahama community attempted to overthrow the Kasakela Alpha. The coup failed, and the conspirators were driven south, taking several females and juveniles with them. They established their own territory, their own hierarchy, their own identity built around opposition to their former community. What followed was a decade of raids, ambushes, and targeted killings. Males from both sides would venture into enemy territory specifically to hunt down isolated individuals and kill them. It wasn't for food or resources. It was simply to reduce the enemy's numbers, to inflict pain and fear, to perpetuate a cycle of revenge that seemed to have no end. By the time Zara reached adolescence, the war had claimed over 20 lives from both communities combined. Entire families had been destroyed. Infants had been orphaned. Territories that should have been rich feeding grounds were abandoned because crossing into them meant almost certain death. The war had become the defining feature of both communities' existence, shaping every decision, every relationship, every aspect of daily life. Zara was born into the Kasakela community, the daughter of a mid-ranking female named Taboo. Her early life was unremarkable by chimpanzee standards. She learned to forage from her mother, played with other juveniles, gradually developed the social skills necessary to navigate the complex hierarchy of her community. But there was something different about Zara, something that became apparent as she grew older. She asked questions, not in words, of course, but through her behavior and attention. When the males returned from raids, celebrating their violence against the Kahama, Zara watched with an expression that older females recognized. It wasn't admiration or excitement. It was confusion and something that looked remarkably like sadness. When she saw injured warriors being groomed and cared for, she would help, but her eyes would drift south, toward Kahama territory, as if wondering about the injured on the other side who had no one to help them. Her mother, Taboo, noticed this tendency and worried about it. In a community defined by its hatred of the enemy, Zara's apparent empathy for Kahama chimpanzees was dangerous. It could be seen as disloyalty, even treason. Taboo tried to correct this behavior, tried to instill in her daughter the proper hatred and fear of the southern community. But Zara resisted in subtle ways, never openly defying her mother but never fully embracing the warrior culture that dominated Kasakela life. The turning point came when Zara was 9 years old. A Kasakela raid had ambushed a young Kahama male at a fruiting tree near the border. The attack was brutal and coordinated. 5 Kasakela warriors against one isolated enemy. They beat him severely, broke his bones, left him for dead. But he didn't die immediately. He crawled toward the border, making pitiful sounds of pain and fear, trying desperately to reach his own territory before death claimed him. Zara found him there, barely alive, blood soaking into the earth beneath him. Every instinct of her upbringing told her to finish him off, or at least to leave him to die. He was the enemy. He would have killed any Kasakela chimpanzee given the chance. His death was not just acceptable, it was desirable. But Zara couldn't do it. She looked at this broken young male, probably about her own age, and she didn't see an enemy. She saw another chimpanzee, suffering and afraid, calling for a mother who would never come. Against all training, against all social pressure, against everything she had been taught about the Kahama, Zara approached him. She didn't attack. She didn't deliver the killing blow that would have been praised by her community. Instead, she groomed him. Gently, carefully, she cleaned his wounds, removed debris from his injuries, provided the small comfort of social touch to a dying chimpanzee who should have been her mortal enemy. The young Kahama male died within the hour, but he died with another chimpanzee beside him, providing care and compassion in his final moments. And something changed in Zara in those moments. She made a decision that would alter the course of both communities. This war had to end, and somehow she would find a way to end it. The challenge was enormous. Zara was a young female in a male-dominated warrior society. She had no formal authority, no position of power, no obvious way to influence the decisions that drove the conflict. The males who led the raids, who celebrated the killings, who perpetuated the hatred, They would never listen to a female, suggesting peace with the enemy they had spent 11 years fighting. But Zara had something that the warriors lacked. She had patience, and she had a plan. She understood something fundamental about chimpanzee society that the males, focused on their displays of dominance and violence, had overlooked. Real power in chimpanzee communities didn't come only from strength or aggression. It came from relationships, from social bonds, from the intricate network of alliances and obligations that held the community together. She became the most dedicated groomer, spending hours each day reinforcing social bonds with other females. She was generous with food sharing, even when it cost her personally. She helped with infant care, earning gratitude from mothers who desperately needed support. Slowly, methodically, she became central to the female social network, the individual everyone turned to for support and connection. As her influence grew, Zara began subtle changes in how females discussed the war. She never openly challenged the conflict or suggested peace. That would have been too radical, too threatening. Instead, she asked questions. She wondered aloud about the costs of the war. How many orphans had it created? How much territory had been abandoned? How many males had died who could have been protecting the community from leopards or helping to find food? The questions planted seeds of doubt. Other females began asking the same questions, began calculating the costs that the males never acknowledged because admitting them would undermine the warrior culture they had built. The war wasn't just killing enemies. It was weakening the Kasakela, making them more vulnerable, reducing their ability to thrive. But questioning the war within her own community was only the first step. Zara's real goal was far more ambitious and far more dangerous. She needed to make contact with the Kahama community. She needed to build relationships across the enemy line. She needed to do something that hadn't happened in 11 years of warfare. She needed to talk to the enemy. The opportunity came during the fruiting season, when both communities ranged more widely in search of food. Zara began venturing to the very edge of Kasakela territory, two areas where Kahama foragers might also come. She was taking an enormous risk. If Kahama warriors found her alone, they would likely kill her on sight. If Kasakela warriors discovered what she was doing, she could be branded a traitor. But Zara was careful and strategic. She chose times when male patrols were unlikely. She watched and learned the patterns of Kahama movement. And eventually, she encountered what she had been hoping for. A small group of Kahama females foraging near the border with their young. The moment of contact was tense and dangerous. The Kahama females saw Zara and immediately went into defensive postures, ready to flee or fight. Zara could see the fear and hatred in their eyes. She was the enemy, a member of the community that had killed their relatives and friends. Every instinct told them to run or attack. But Zara did something unexpected. She sat down, making herself small and non-threatening. She didn't try to communicate directly. She simply sat, relaxed and calm, and began eating fruit from a nearby tree. Her body language communicated clearly. I am not a threat. I am just eating. There is enough food for all of us. The Kahama females were confused. This wasn't how enemies behaved. They expected aggression or flight, not this calm acceptance of proximity. Slowly, cautiously, they resumed their own foraging, keeping careful watch on Zara but not fleeing. For perhaps 20 minutes, chimpanzees from communities that had been at war for 11 years simply fed near each other, separated by perhaps 30 meters, with no violence. Then Zara did something even more remarkable. She found a particularly good fruit, a ripe fig from a high branch, and instead of eating it herself, she placed it on the ground, midway between herself and the Kahama females. Then she backed away. The gesture was clear. This is a gift. This is a peace offering. One of the Kahama females, braver or more curious than the others, approached the fruit. She looked at Zara, looked at the fig, looked back at Zara, then she picked it up and ate it. And in that simple exchange, the first crack appeared in the wall of hatred that separated the two communities. Over the following weeks, Zara continued her dangerous border diplomacy. She would venture to neutral areas, always alone, always during times when male patrols were unlikely. Sometimes she encountered the same Kahama females. Sometimes it was different individuals. But gradually, a pattern emerged. These females began to recognize her, to anticipate her presence, to accept her as something other than simply an enemy. The breakthrough came when one of the Kahama females, a mother with a young infant, experienced a crisis. Her baby had fallen from a tree and was injured, not critically, but enough to prevent normal movement. The mother was distressed, unable to both carry the injured infant and forage effectively. She needed help, but in the war-torn environment, help was scarce. Zara witnessed this crisis and made an instant decision. She approached, carefully and slowly, making soothing vocalizations. The Kahama mother was torn between need and fear, but desperation won out. She allowed Zara to approach, to examine the infant, to help. Together, the two females fashioned a crude sling from leaves and vines. allowing the mother to carry her infant more securely. Zara even shared food with them, ensuring the mother had enough nutrition to produce milk. This act of compassion across enemy lines created a bond that transcended the war. The Kahama mother, whose name was Nero, became Zara's ally in the southern community. She began to speak to other Kahama females about this unusual Kasakela chimpanzee who had helped when she needed it most. And gradually, a parallel network began forming in Kahama territory. Females questioning the war, wondering if there might be another way. But Zara knew that female solidarity, powerful as it was, wouldn't be enough to end the war. The males, particularly the alphas and senior warriors of both communities, were deeply invested in the conflict. It gave them status, purpose, and a clear outlet for their aggression. Ending the war would require them to give up something central to their identity. The male who would become key to Zara's peace plan was Jabari, a young Kasakela warrior who was rising through the ranks. He was skilled in combat, had participated in several successful raids, and was being groomed as a potential future alpha. By all accounts, Jabari should have been the most committed to continuing the war. But he had a secret that Zara discovered through careful observation. Jabari was tired. The constant vigilance, the raids, the fear of ambush, the loss of friends and allies, all of it was wearing on him in ways he couldn't express without appearing weak. He went through the motions of warrior culture, displayed the appropriate aggression and celebration after successful raids, but his eyes told a different story. He was a warrior who had lost faith in war. Zara approached Jabari carefully, using her network of female relationships to arrange casual encounters, opportunities for grooming and social bonding. She never spoke directly about the war at first. She simply provided comfort and acceptance, a respite from the constant pressure to perform violence and dominance. And gradually, Jabari began to trust her in ways that warriors typically didn't trust females. When Zara finally broached the subject of peace, she did it through the lens of Jabari's own interests. She pointed out that the war was preventing him from achieving true alpha status. As long as the conflict continued, the current leadership could justify their positions through military necessity. But if someone could end the war, could bring peace and prosperity, that individual would be remembered as the greatest leader in community history. She was offering Jabari a path to power that didn't require defeating rivals in combat. He could become alpha, not by being the strongest fighter, but by being the wisest peacemaker. It was a radical proposition, but it appealed to something in Jabari that the war had been suppressing. He was intelligent enough to understand strategy, to see beyond immediate violence to longer-term consequences. Together, Zara and Jabari began planning how to end the war. It would require coordinated action in both communities, creating momentum for peace that would overwhelm the opposition of hardline warriors. It would require careful timing, taking advantage of moments when both communities were exhausted from conflict and open to alternatives. And most dangerously, it would require direct negotiation with the Kahama, a face-to-face meeting between communities that had been killing each other for over a decade. The opportunity came in the form of a tragedy that affected both communities. A leopard, bolder than usual, had established territory that overlapped with both Kasakela and Kahama ranges. It had killed individuals from both communities, including infants and juveniles. The leopard represented a threat that neither community could effectively counter while also maintaining their war against each other. Zara saw this as the opening she needed. Through Nuru, she proposed an unprecedented joint operation. Both communities would contribute warriors to hunt the leopard, pooling their strength against a common enemy. It would require a temporary truce, a suspension of hostilities, and most challengingly, actual cooperation between chimpanzees who had been trained to kill each other on sight. The proposal was met with intense resistance in both communities. Hardline warriors argued it was a trap, that the other side would use the opportunity to launch devastating attacks. Others questioned why they should help the enemy with their leopard problem when they could simply wait for the predator to weaken the Kahama further. But the deaths had created genuine fear, particularly among the females and their offspring. The leopard didn't respect community boundaries or political conflicts. It was killing children, and mothers across both communities were desperate for protection that their divided warriors couldn't provide. This fear, channeled by Zara's network and Nuru's parallel efforts in Kahama territory, created pressure that the male leadership couldn't completely ignore. Jabari took the risk of publicly supporting the joint operation. He framed it not as peace or surrender, but as tactical intelligence. By working with the Kahama temporarily, they could assess enemy strength, identify vulnerabilities, gather information that would be useful when the war inevitably resumed. It was a face-saving rationalization that allowed warriors to participate without admitting they wanted peace. The Kahama Alpha, a battle-scarred veteran named Kondo, made similar calculations. His community had been weakened by years of warfare, losing more battles than they won. The leopard threat was real and dangerous. If a temporary alliance with the Kasakela could eliminate that threat while also providing opportunity to assess the enemy's current capabilities, it was worth the risk. The joint operation was arranged to take place at a neutral location, a rocky outcrop between the territories where both communities could gather with some security. The terms were carefully negotiated through intermediaries, primarily Zara and Nero, who had become the unofficial diplomatic channel between the communities. The day of the gathering was tense beyond description. Dozens of chimpanzees from both sides approached the neutral zone, each group bristling with suspicion and fear. Males from both communities displayed aggressively, beating chests and dragging branches, each side trying to appear more intimidating than the other. One wrong move, one aggressive gesture misinterpreted, and the gathering could dissolve into the bloodiest battle yet. Zara positioned herself at the center, between the two groups. It was an incredibly dangerous position. She was vulnerable to attack from either side, and if violence erupted, she would likely be the first casualty. But her presence there, a female deliberately placing herself in the line of potential fire, sent a powerful message. This gathering was too important to be destroyed by male posturing and aggression. Jabari and Kondo, the de facto leaders of their respective communities, faced each other across a gap of perhaps 20 meters. Neither would approach the other first. To do so would be seen as submission, a loss of status that neither could afford. They stood in tense standoff, waiting for something to break the impasse. What broke it was unexpected. A juvenile from the Kahama community, no more than 4 years old, wandered forward. Too young to fully understand the hatred between the groups, curious about the strange chimpanzees across the divide, the youngster simply walked toward the Kasakela group with innocent interest. Nero, the juvenile's mother, moved to grab her child, to pull him back to safety. But Zara intercepted her, gently blocking her path. She looked at Nero with an expression that communicated clearly. Let him go. Let them see that your child doesn't fear them. Let them see innocence that hasn't been corrupted by war. The juvenile reached the Kasakela side and approached one of the warriors, a massive male who had killed several Kahama in raids. The warrior looked down at this small, defenseless enemy offspring. This creature he had been taught to hate. He could kill it easily, could strike a blow against the Kahama that would restart the war immediately. But he didn't. Instead, this battle-hardened warrior did something that shocked everyone present. He groomed the juvenile, gently picking through the youngster's fur in the universal chimpanzee gesture of care and affection. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted. If a warrior could show compassion to an enemy child, then perhaps the enemy weren't really enemies after all. Perhaps they were just other chimpanzees, divided by history and hatred, but fundamentally the same. The leopard hunt that followed the unprecedented gathering was awkward and tense, but it was functional. Warriors from both communities moved through the forest in a coordinated effort, their shared fear of the predator temporarily overcoming their fear and hatred of each other. They tracked the leopard to its den, a rocky crevice in a hillside, and mounted a coordinated assault that would have been impossible for either community alone. The battle was fierce. The leopard was a formidable predator, and it fought desperately against the dozens of chimpanzees that surrounded it. Several warriors from both communities were injured in the conflict, clawed and bitten as they pressed the attack. But the sheer numbers prevailed. The leopard was killed, and both communities celebrated together, their victory cries mingling in a way that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. In the aftermath of the hunt, something remarkable happened. Warriors from both sides who had been injured in the fight against the leopard found themselves being cared for by members of the opposing community. A Kasakela female cleaned wounds on a Kahama male. A Kahama warrior shared food with injured Kasakela fighters. The lines between communities blurred as the immediate needs of care and recovery took precedence over political divisions. Zara watched all of this with a mixture of hope and anxiety. This was progress, undeniable evidence that cooperation was possible. But she knew that the hardliners in both communities would view this cooperation as threatening. They would work to reassert the divisions, to remind everyone of the reasons for the war, to pull the communities back into their comfortable patterns of hatred. The test came sooner than she expected. A Kasakela warrior named Doom, one of the most vocal supporters of the war, confronted Jabari publicly. He accused the young warrior of weakness, of betraying the community by cooperating with the enemy. He pointed to the Kahama males present and reminded everyone of the Kasakela warriors they had killed, the families they had destroyed, the blood debt that could only be repaid through continued warfare. Doom's challenge put Jabari in an impossible position. If he backed down, he would lose the credibility he needed to push for peace. But if he fought Doom, he would be reinforcing the very culture of violence he was trying to end. The confrontation threatened to unravel everything Zara had been working toward. But Zara had prepared for this moment. She had built her network specifically to counter challenges like Doom's. Before Jabari could respond, a coalition of females moved forward, positioning themselves between the two males. They didn't challenge Doom directly, which would have been a violation of social norms. Instead, they simply made his aggression impossible to execute without attacking females, something that would cost him all social support. More importantly, one of the females who stepped forward was Doom's own mother, an elderly matriarch named Mamara. She looked at her son with an expression that transcended words. She had lost 2 other offspring to the war, both killed in raids against the Kahama. She had mourned them, had supported the warrior culture that had claimed their lives, but she was done. She had no more sons to give to this endless conflict. Amara's intervention shamed Doom more effectively than any challenge from Jabari could have. He retreated, unable to maintain his aggressive posture in the face of his mother's implicit rebuke. And her action gave permission to other females to express their own exhaustion with the war, their own desire for an alternative. From the Kahama side, Niru and her network of female allies made similar moves, countering the hardliners in their own community who wanted to use the leopard hunt as an opportunity to attack the Kasakela. They didn't argue for peace directly, they simply asked questions. How many more children need to die? How much more territory must we abandon? How long can we sustain this war before there's nothing left to fight for? Over the following weeks, Zara worked to institutionalize the cooperation that had emerged from the leopard hunt. She arranged regular meetings between females from both communities, ostensibly to coordinate responses to shared threats, but actually to build relationships and normalize interaction. She encouraged mixed foraging parties, groups that included members from both communities gathering food together. The males, particularly the warriors who had participated in the leopard hunt, began their own informal interactions. They found that they had more in common with each other than with the civilians in their own communities. They shared experiences of battle, understood the psychological costs of violence in ways that non-warriors couldn't, and many of them, like Jabari, were tired of the endless cycle of raids and revenge. But Zara knew that informal cooperation wasn't enough. As long as the formal state of war continued, as long as the communities maintained separate identities defined by opposition to each other, there would always be risk of relapse into violence. She needed something more permanent, more structural. She needed to fundamentally reorganize how the communities understood themselves and their relationship to each other. Her solution was radical and drew on observations she had made of human researchers who studied the chimpanzees. She had noticed how humans could maintain distinct identities while still cooperating as part of larger organizations. They could be members of different families, different tribes, different nations, but still work together toward common goals. What if chimpanzee communities could do something similar? What if Kasakela and Kahama could maintain their distinct identities but function as allied communities rather than enemies? They could have separate territories but shared borders that both could use. They could maintain separate leadership but coordinate on common threats. They could preserve their unique cultures while ending the warfare that was destroying both. The proposal required extensive negotiation between Jabari and Kondo, the respective leaders. Neither wanted to surrender their community's independence or identity, but both recognized that the current path was unsustainable. The war had weakened both communities to the point where they were vulnerable to external threats. Continuing it would only accelerate their decline. The formal peace agreement was negotiated over months, with Zara and Neros serving as primary intermediaries. The terms were complex, balancing the need for security with the desire for cooperation. There would be a demilitarized zone between the territories where no patrols or raids would occur. There would be regular joint gatherings to address common concerns. There would be exchanges of young females between communities, creating kinship ties that crossed the old enemy lines. Most radically, there would be a joint council, including leaders from both communities, that would make decisions affecting both groups. This council would include not just males but also senior females, recognizing the crucial role that Zara's network had played in creating peace. It was an unprecedented structure in wild chimpanzee society, a genuine attempt at creating intercommunity governance. The announcement of the peace agreement was met with mixed reactions. Many in both communities were relieved, exhausted by years of conflict and ready for change. Others were skeptical, doubting that ancient hatreds could be overcome so easily. And a minority, the hardline warriors who had built their identities around the war, were openly hostile, viewing the peace as betrayal. The first major test of the peace came quickly. A young Kasakela male, acting either from residual hatred or simple stupidity, attacked a Kahama female at a shared foraging site. The attack was quickly stopped by other Kasakela members, but the damage was done. The Kahama demanded justice, punishment for the violation of the peace agreement. The hardliners in Kasakela argued that protecting their own member was more important than appeasing the former enemy. Zara and Jabari faced a critical choice. If they protected the attacker, they would signal that the peace agreement was meaningless, that Kasakela members could attack Kahama without consequence. But if they punished him severely, they would alienate the hardliners in their own community and potentially trigger internal conflict. Their solution was to involve the Joint Council, using this crisis as an opportunity to establish the legitimacy of the new governance structure. The case was presented to representatives from both communities, who deliberated and reached a consensus. The attacker would be temporarily exiled from both territories, banished to the buffer zone for a period of weeks. It was severe enough to satisfy Kahama demands for justice, but not so extreme as to trigger Kasakela backlash. More importantly, the process demonstrated that the Joint Council could function, could make difficult decisions that both communities would accept. It established precedent for peaceful conflict resolution, creating an alternative to the violence that had defined inter-community relations for so long. Over the following year, the peace between Kasakela and Kahama deepened and became normalized. The benefits were undeniable. Both communities expanded into territories they had previously abandoned as too dangerous. Food became more abundant as foraging areas were shared rather than fought over. Infant mortality decreased as resources improved and the threat of raids disappeared. The female exchange program that Zara had advocated proved particularly effective. Young females from each community who transferred to the other brought with them knowledge, skills, and most importantly, kinship connections that crossed the old boundary lines. When a Kasakela female gave birth in Kahama territory, she created family ties that linked members of both communities. These personal connections made future conflict not just undesirable but unthinkable. How could you raid a community that included your sister, your niece, your daughter? But the peace created new challenges that Zara hadn't fully anticipated. With the external enemy gone, internal tensions within each community became more prominent. In the Kasakela, Jabari's rise to alpha status, achieved through peacemaking rather than traditional combat dominance, was resented by some traditionalists who felt he hadn't earned his position properly. In Kahama, Kondo faced similar challenges from warriors who felt that ending the war had robbed them of purpose and status. More concerning was the emergence of a new threat that neither community had paid sufficient attention to during the war years. Human activity in the Gombe region was increasing dramatically. Logging operations were approaching from the east, agricultural settlements expanding from the west. The forest that both chimpanzee communities depended on was being fragmented and destroyed at an accelerating rate. Zara recognized that the peace she had worked so hard to create might be meaningless if the communities lost their habitat entirely. She needed to expand her diplomatic efforts beyond intercommunity relations to address this larger existential threat. But how could chimpanzees influence human behavior? They had no common language, no obvious way to communicate their needs or concerns. Her answer came from observing the human researchers who studied them. These researchers clearly cared about chimpanzee welfare, documented their behaviors with fascination and concern. What if Zara could use that concern, could deliberately behave in ways that would attract human attention and sympathy in ways that might influence human decision-making? She began a campaign of strategic visibility. She led mixed groups of Kasakela and Kahama chimpanzees to areas near human observation posts, demonstrating the peaceful cooperation between formerly warring communities. She ensured that the researchers witnessed grooming between previous enemies, saw shared foraging and cooperative childcare. She was essentially performing peace, making sure that humans documented and understood the remarkable social changes that had occurred. The strategy worked better than she could have hoped. The researchers were fascinated by what they were witnessing, recognizing it as unprecedented in wild chimpanzee behavior. Papers were written, documentaries were filmed. The story of the Kasakela Kahama piece became internationally known in human, academic, and conservation circles. This attention translated into increased protection. Conservation organizations used the unique nature of these communities as justification for expanded protection zones. Government agencies faced pressure to reroute development projects to avoid disrupting these remarkable chimpanzees. The piece that Zara had created became a tool for habitat conservation, demonstrating that chimpanzees were capable of complex social evolution worthy of protection and study. But success brought its own complications. The increased human presence, even when well-intentioned, was disruptive. Researchers and tourists wanted to observe the peaceful interactions, sometimes getting too close, sometimes interfering with natural behaviors. The communities that had learned to live with each other now had to learn to live with constant human observation. Zara approached this challenge the same way she had approached ending the war, through patient relationship building and strategic positioning. She identified which individual humans were most respectful, which could be trusted to maintain appropriate distance, which were most likely to cause problems. She taught her community to distinguish between different types of human presence and to respond appropriately to each. More radically, she began to actively shape human behavior through her own actions. When researchers got too close, she would move away, teaching them through her response that they needed to maintain distance. When they maintained appropriate boundaries, she would display behaviors they wanted to see, effectively rewarding their respect. She was training humans the same way she had built social networks within and between chimpanzee communities, using relationship and incentive to shape behavior. As Zara approached her 15th year, she had achieved something that no chimpanzee in recorded history had accomplished. She had ended a decade-long war, created a functional inter-community alliance, and leveraged that achievement to protect habitat from human destruction. She had done all of this, not through physical dominance or male-typical aggression, but through social intelligence, coalition building, and strategic relationship management. Her influence extended far beyond her own community. Other chimpanzee groups in the region, hearing through the grapevine of primate communication about what had happened in Gombe, began to reconsider their own conflicts and territorial disputes. If Kasakela and Kahama could make peace after 11 years of brutal warfare, perhaps other enemies could find ways to coexist as well. But Zara's greatest achievement was less tangible and harder to measure. She had fundamentally changed how chimpanzees and her communities thought about conflict and cooperation. Young chimpanzees growing up in the post-war era didn't learn to hate the neighboring community. They learned that former enemies could become allies, that peace was possible, that there were alternatives to violence. The story of how Zara accomplished this spread, not just through academic papers but through popular media, capturing human imagination in ways that typical chimpanzee research rarely did. Here was a story of intelligence triumphing over instinct, of compassion overcoming hatred, of one individual's vision changing an entire society. It was a narrative that resonated across species, suggesting that peace was not just possible but achievable even in societies built on violence. In her later years, Zara became something rare in chimpanzee society, a recognized elder stateswoman whose influence transcended traditional hierarchy. She held no formal position of dominance, participated in no displays of aggression or status competition. But when disputes arose, both within and between communities, individuals sought her out for mediation and guidance. She had become living proof that power could take forms other than physical dominance, that influence could be built through relationship and wisdom rather than fear and violence. Young females watched her and learned that they didn't have to accept subordinate positions passively. They could build networks, could shape decisions, could change their societies through strategic action. But Zara's influence wasn't limited to females. Males, particularly younger ones who had grown up during the peace rather than the war, also sought her counsel. They recognized that the old warrior culture, while still present in their genetic and cultural heritage, wasn't the only path to status and respect. They could earn leadership through problem-solving, diplomacy, and social intelligence. The joint council that Zara had helped establish evolved into a genuine governance structure, meeting regularly to address challenges facing both communities. It dealt with territory management, resolved disputes, coordinated responses to external threats, and even began planning for long-term sustainability in ways that short-term focused chimpanzee cognition rarely achieved. One of the most significant challenges the council addressed was succession planning. Both Jabari and Kasakela and Kondo and Kahama were aging, and their eventual replacement could potentially destabilize the peace if it reverted to traditional violent succession. Zara proposed something unprecedented, a managed transition where current leaders would identify and train their successors, transferring power gradually rather than through violent overthrow. The proposal was controversial, challenging the deepest instincts of chimpanzee political culture. But the benefits of peace had been so substantial, the costs of war so clearly remembered, that even traditionalists were willing to consider alternatives. Jabari and Kondo, recognizing their own mortality and concerned about their legacies, embraced the concept. They began deliberately mentoring younger males who showed not just physical strength but diplomatic skill and strategic thinking. The first test of this managed succession came when Kondo, weakened by age and injury, voluntarily stepped down from leadership of the Kahama community. Instead of the traditional power vacuum that would trigger violent competition, he publicly endorsed a successor, a mature male named Hassani, who had proven himself in both the war years and the peace that followed. The transition was still contentious, with some younger males challenging Hassani's assumption of power, but the violence was minimal compared to what would have occurred under traditional succession. More remarkably, the Kasakela community accepted this transition peacefully, recognizing Hassani as a legitimate leader rather than viewing the succession crisis as an opportunity to attack a weakened Kahama. The joint council continued to function, with Hassani taking Kondo's place as if the change in leadership was a normal administrative adjustment rather than a potentially destabilizing event. Zara watched this unfold with quiet satisfaction. The structures she had built were proving resilient enough to survive leadership transitions, to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core principles of cooperation and peaceful conflict resolution. The peace was becoming institutionalized, embedded in the social fabric deeply enough that it might persist even after she was gone. But the challenges never stopped coming. A severe drought struck the region when Zara was 17, creating resource scarcity that tested the alliance in ways that political conflicts never had. Under the old system, such scarcity would have intensified warfare as each community tried to monopolize dwindling resources. Under the peace agreement, resources were supposed to be shared, but that principle was much easier to maintain during abundance than scarcity. The Joint Council met repeatedly during the drought, mediating disputes over access to the few remaining water sources and productive feeding areas. Zara played a crucial role in these mediations, reminding participants of the costs of returning to war, pointing out that competition would only accelerate the depletion of resources that cooperation might preserve. Her most effective argument was practical rather than moral. She demonstrated that coordinated use of scarce resources allowed both communities to survive, while competition would lead to conflict that would kill more chimpanzees than starvation. The drought was temporary, she argued, but the damage from renewed warfare would be permanent. Better to share limited resources and both survive in weakened condition than to fight over them and risk community collapse. The strategy worked, but barely. Both communities survived the drought, and the alliance survived with them, but the experience revealed vulnerabilities. Peace built on prosperity was easier to maintain than peace tested by genuine hardship. If conditions deteriorated further, if environmental challenges intensified, the alliance might fracture under pressures that goodwill and wise leadership couldn't overcome. This recognition leads Zara to her final major initiative, building resilience beyond just inter-community cooperation. She began advocating for practices that would make both communities more sustainable, more capable of weathering environmental challenges without reverting to destructive competition. This meant controlling population growth, managing resources more carefully, even coordinating with other chimpanzee communities in the region to create a broader network of cooperation. The latter goal was perhaps her most ambitious. If the Kasakela and Kahama alliance could be extended to include other communities, it could create a regional network that would be far more resilient than any individual community or bilateral alliance. But this required convincing chimpanzees who hadn't experienced the war, who didn't have the same motivation for peace, to embrace cooperation that went against their territorial instincts. Zara approached this through demonstration and invitation rather than persuasion. She arranged for representatives from other communities to visit and observe the Joint Council, to see firsthand how cooperation functioned. She ensured these visitors were treated well, given access to resources, shown the benefits of alliance. And gradually, curiosity about this unusual arrangement spread to other communities. To smaller neighboring communities, inspired by what they witnessed and facing their own challenges, approached the Joint Council requesting association with the alliance. The request created immediate controversy. Expanding the alliance would dilute resources, create more complexity, potentially destabilize the carefully balanced relationship between Kasakela and Kahama. But it also offered benefits: larger numbers for defense, broader genetic diversity, more robust social networks. After extensive deliberation, the Council agreed to accept the new communities on a provisional basis, with clear terms about resource sharing, conflict resolution, and mutual defense. The alliance expanded from 2 communities to 4, creating a network of over 160 chimpanzees cooperating across what had previously been hostile territorial boundaries. The expansion brought new challenges, but also new capabilities. When human development threatened to fragment habitat, the 4-community alliance could coordinate responses more effectively than isolated groups. When disease struck one community, others could provide support and assistance. When resources were abundant in one territory but scarce in another, they could be shared to even out the distribution. Zara's vision of a cooperative network was becoming reality, and its success was attracting attention far beyond chimpanzee society. Human researchers documented what they recognized as a revolutionary development in primate social organization, evidence of cognitive and social capabilities that challenged existing understanding of what chimpanzees could achieve. Conservation strategies in the region began to shift, recognizing that protecting individual communities wasn't enough. The entire network needed protection. The relationships between communities were as important as the communities themselves. This led to expanded protected areas, corridors connecting territories, coordinated management that acknowledged the social complexity of the chimpanzee population. When Zara was 19 years old, she witnessed something that confirmed the lasting nature of her achievement. A juvenile born after the war, who had never known the conflict between Kasakela and Kahama, asked an elder about the territorial boundary that older chimpanzees still occasionally referenced. The elder explained that it had once divided enemies, but now just marked different home ranges within a larger allied network. The juvenile looked confused, unable to understand why anyone would fight over such arbitrary divisions. This failure of understanding, this inability to comprehend the hatred that had once seemed natural and inevitable, was perhaps the clearest evidence that Zara had succeeded. The war that had consumed 2 communities for over a decade was becoming forgotten history, incomprehensible to a generation raised in peace. The cycle of hatred had been broken, replaced by assumptions of cooperation that the younger generation took for granted. Zara died at the age of 21, old for a wild chimpanzee but young by human standards. Her death was peaceful, surrounded by community members from both Kasakela and Kahama who had come to pay respects. The mourning that followed crossed all community boundaries, with chimpanzees from the entire alliance gathering to mark her passing. The Joint Council continued to function after her death, dealing with new challenges and adapting to changing circumstances. The alliance she had built proved resilient enough to survive its founder, to evolve beyond her direct guidance. Young females who had watched her and learned from her carried forward her methods, building their own networks, solving new problems through cooperation and strategic relationship building. Her legacy was visible not just in the structures she had created, but in the changed assumptions of multiple generations. Chimpanzees in the Gombe region approached conflict differently because of her. sought cooperation before violence, built relationships across traditional boundaries. The war between Kasakela and Kahama became a historical curiosity, studied by researchers as an example of how even deeply entrenched conflicts could be resolved through intelligence and persistence. The human researchers who had documented her life struggled to categorize what they had witnessed. Zara's achievements challenged fundamental assumptions about female roles in primate societies, about the limits of chimpanzee social cognition, about the possibility of peace in species governed by territorial instincts and male dominance hierarchies. She had demonstrated that individual agency could change social systems, that wisdom could triumph over violence, that peace was not just an absence of war but a positive achievement requiring constant effort and renewal. For the chimpanzees who lived in the network she had created, Zara was remembered simply as the one who ended the war, who showed them a better way to live. Young chimpanzees growing up in the alliance didn't know the details of her diplomatic efforts or the complexity of her coalition building. They just knew that they lived in peace because of something she had done, that the cooperation they experienced daily was possible because she had made it so. Her story became part of the oral tradition passed through generations, told through gesture and expression, preserved in the social memory of communities she had transformed. When conflicts arose, elders would remind participants of Zara's methods, of how she had resolved seemingly impossible disputes through patience and strategic thinking. When young females wondered whether they could make a difference, they were told about Zara, about how one individual with vision and determination had changed everything. In the forests of Gombe, where two communities had once fought an 11-year war over territory and ancient grievances, chimpanzees now lived in an alliance that spanned multiple communities and generations. They shared resources, resolved conflicts peacefully, cooperated against common threats. They did all of this not because it was instinctive or natural, but because one female chimpanzee had shown them it was possible, had built the structures and relationships that made peace achievable and sustainable. This was Zara's legacy, proof that even in species driven by instinct and hierarchy, intelligence and compassion could create change. That war was not inevitable, that peace was not impossible, that one individual's vision could transform society. Her story reminded all who heard it, whether chimpanzee or human, that the future was not predetermined, that choice mattered, that even the most entrenched conflicts could be resolved if someone was brave enough to try and wise enough to succeed. The peacemaker who had ended an 11-year war without firing a shot, without winning a single fight, without displaying dominance through violence. The female who had achieved what no male could, creating lasting change through relationship building and strategic intelligence. This was Zara, the chimpanzee, who proved that there was more than one kind of strength, more than one path to greatness, more than one way to change the world.